Now, the point of the paper is for me to test or to try to what I want to do in this bigger project about constitutional imaginaries of the European Union. So I want to tell you a bit about the project itself, and it relates to the conference agenda paper, which I hope most of you have read. And then this paper about the transformation of Europe is, in a way, to me, to try to find a way how to conduct part of the project. So, as I also explained in the beginning of the conference and in my invitation, I am really interested into ideas as such. So, to me, there is now very much interesting scholarship in new legal history, and we had Morten yesterday to talk about constitutionalization and what kind of actors were involved in that, and what kind of tactiques and strategies they were using to promote the concept of European constitution. We also have very rich scholarship in the sociology of European law. Michael is one of the promoters. Antoine Vaucher, who is now on some wedding somewhere in Africa, so that's the only reason he couldn't come, because otherwise he would be here as well. They also provide very stimulating and important insights into the dynamics of European constitutional law. But what I think is still missing is something in between these two, and that's a story which can be told, I think, only by a lawyer, with apologies to everybody who sits around the table and is not a lawyer. And we've seen already when Matthias proposed that there is this centrality of lawyers, that people from IR or political theory might not like it that much. So what I want to do in this project is not to claim the whole process of European constitutionalization for lawyers or for the legal academic discipline, but to really understand what was going on. And it's also partially my very personal project, because in fact, and that's in fact the kind of story you can find in the collection of essays which reflect on the transformation of Europe. Then Sasha Somek mentions it. Then there is another chapter by Julio Baquero Cruz, where they basically say European Union law seemed to be very boring, technical, administrative law. Why I would be ever interested in that? And then Joseph Weiler comes with his transformation of Europe, and suddenly it becomes so enchanting that Sasha is spending most of his career exploring European constitutional or European public law. And to me, it's something I just want to understand. Now, of course, there is a story which can be told by historians, and there is now an article in the German Law Journal about the Integration Through Law project, where, of course, Joseph Weiler played a very important role. And I also know from him that he found it quite embarrassing to just read about himself as a young PhD student who was then co-opted into this project, and then he became the Joseph Weiler we know. And that's, as I said, not the story I want to say, I want to tell. And of course, there is also part of the sort of sociology of the field of European law, which is quite important. And we have many explanations why the European University Institute and Joseph Weiler could become that important in this discourse. But as I said, I'm interested in the power of the ideas which I contained in the transformation of Europe. And how I want to approach it is what perhaps can be called a critical intellectual history of the European Union constitutional debate. And as I also mentioned in the introduction to this paper, to me, of course, Joseph Weiler is not the only one I want to talk about in this bigger project, because there are many other strands. But in my view, for a significant period of time, the school of constitutional thought, which somewhat centered around his work, and which I think can be located in Fiesole at the EUI, dominated the discourse of European constitutional law. So that's also, I think, a reason for me to take it as a starting point into this broader project. Now, just a few words about this broader project before I move on to the paper about the transformation of Europe. So in this project, what I want to do is essentially two big things. Well, big things. You always want to do big things, so yeah. And this is not an interview to get the grant anymore, so I just do not need to overplay the whole thing. But one is to really discover alternative constitutionalist discourses, which I'm sure many of you will know, but I don't know because I'm very much embedded in this EUI tradition, and then I'm also limited by language into what I can reasonably know about constitutional theory of the European Union and European integration. But what I want to know is the separate discourses of Europe in different member states and their constitutional theories. And in a way, it relates to some points which have been made in this conference, and that's that we cannot really separate national constitutional theory in post-war Europe and the theory of European Union constitutional law or post-national constitutional law or whatever you have beyond the national constitutional tradition. So what I want to react to in this project is, for me, another big figure, Dieter Grimm, who, when he tells you the story about Germany in the context of the European integration, to me it seems that it's a story of a pure, perfect German basic law, and then it gets tainted by European integration. And of course, it's just, again, overplayed what I'm saying, but you get the sense from his last books which deal with European constitutionalism. And what I'm interested in is really how national doctrines and also national theories of constitutional law were somewhat conditioned by the fact that they were developed in the context of the member states of the European Union or states which aspired to be the member states of the European Union. Now, adding to this, there is also a dimension of dynamics between East and West, or between what perhaps may be called Old Europe, with all problems which it can bring, because of course old Germany is different as a member state than Austria, which joined in 1995 and has a very different history, post-war history, than Germany and other member states. But to me, that's the member states which were the members before 2004, when the post-communist member states joined the European Union. And to me, it's also very personal sort of project, because as you know, I come from the Czech Republic. And to me, for a very long time, there was this dynamics, which I think was nicely illustrated yesterday when I only reacted to Luc van Middelaar, for whom, and I think it's quite prevalent, the symbol of 1989 is the fall of Berlin Wall. And then in Eastern Germany, you didn't really have significant emancipatory or dissident movement compared to what you had in Poland or in the Czech Republic. And still is the Berlin Wall, which represents 1989, the end of the Cold War and the fall of the communism. So it's just an illustration of what I'm concerned with, and what I tried to explore in a paper I wrote back in 2014, when I was invited by Joseph Weiler to a conference to reconsider one hand and laws ruling. And you know, when you get these invitations, sometimes a title is suggested to you, and the title which was suggested to me in 2014 was The Politics of Euro-Constitutionalism in New Europe. And I have immediately asked, so for how long is the post-communist Europe to be considered a new Europe? So do we need to wait somewhere, you know, in the waiting room to become part of Europe for next 10, 15 years before we all become united? And to me, and that's perhaps too much informed by what I know of the Czech history, the history of Czechoslovak statehood, and we've just celebrated centenary last weekend. And there is an ongoing debate which dates back to the 19th century about the place of Czechoslovakia or the Czech nation in Europe. And this constant articulation of the relationship of the country to its neighbors, on the one hand to Russia and later Soviet Union, and to the West on the other. And it's still ongoing, as we can also see from the current geopolitics of the post-communist member states. And to me, it's not really articulated very well in the thinking about national constitutions. All right, so that's also a significant part of the project, to explore these national discourses of constitutional theory, constitutional doctrine, as they relate to the place of and conceptualizations of national constitutions, national statehood, in relation to the wider world. Right, so my part in that project is then to focus on EU constitutionalists. So as it goes with these bigger projects, some interesting bits are hopefully going to be done by postdoc students and PhD students, and I want to focus on on the part with which I began, and that's trying to understand the place of important scholars and their scholarship in the context of the wider development of the European constitutional law and constitutional theory. And as I also said, the transformation of Europe is, for me, I think, an ideal starting point. Also because there is now this collection of essays. I should have brought it, but I didn't. But I think most of you will know that it was published last year, edited by my colleague Marlene Wind and Miguel Maduro, also as an editor of a book which was published by the CUP. And to me, book is significant in several ways. One is, you can ask an obvious question, so why should we read The Transformation of Europe today? Is it because we think that it made a significant contribution to the development, but since then we have moved on, and what we can do is just to celebrate and say, yeah, it did its work back in 1991 and later, but today the questions it poses are not really the questions which would be relevant or interesting to us. And there are contributions to that book which do precisely that, but there are also contributions which still engage with some of the deep questions which were posed by the transformation of Europe. And what I want to do in this paper, and I still don't, is to show that first they are still embedded in this legacy or this worldview of Joseph Weiler as it was sketched or as it was put forward in The Transformation of Europe. Do I have 5 minutes or 1 minute? 1 minute. And that's only the beginning of the second paper, so that's great. It's finally I have something to say.
Yeah. Relaxed with you. No, I can't.
So I'll just sort of very briefly describe what I want to do in this paper and what is still not really being done. And that's of course just doing something different than the book did, as also Calypso already told me that I should not be doing another contribution to the book which has been published because the train has departed, and that's true, and I may be sorry that I was not invited to write for the book, but simply that's how things happen. But that's not really my intention, because I really want to engage not only with the transformation of Europe, but also with the scholars who somewhat relate to that essay, and to try to explore what its constitutional imaginary is, and not only of the essay, but also of the people who contributed to that essay, and to see what sort of utopias it can build, but also its ideological effect. So it really boils down to this dichotomy I still find as analytically very helpful, to see these ideas as potentially ideological, but also setting forth some sort of utopias or aspirations. And of course, I now know that I have to be very careful with, imagination, imaginaries, utopias, aspirational ideas, and all that. And again, it's not really very much articulated in the paper. Now, of course, there is a danger. I know I'm being recorded, and I doubt that Joseph Weiler will ever just see this contribution, so I can make also these observations on the essay. And the problem which I might run into, and I just discovered that, is that, of course, when I read The Transformation of Europe for the first time, I was just an LLM student somewhere, not really knowing much about constitutional theory or legal theory, and it looked to me, it really had that effect described by Sasha and Julio Baquero in the book. But then it's 15 years ago already, so I have moved on, I have read more stuff, and now when I really want to dig deeper into Joseph Weiler's idea, I just realized, well, he was just 30 when he started to write this as a PhD student, so possibly he's doing the thing which most or many academics are doing, that you just, allude to an idea or to a book, but you do not really know very deeply what it is really about, because you just like the sound of it, or you want to attach to some sort of debate, but you are not really committed to it because it's not really your project. And there are many such allusions in the essay, which is then problematic when it then ends up as a sort of petty criticism of Joseph Weiler, who when he was 30 writing his first PhD or his first serious work, he didn't really read deeply all this philosophical stuff he's invoking in the essay. But still, I think there is more than this. Because, as I mentioned, there are some elements of this imaginary which remain with us, and I'll finish in 1 minute. I just grant myself more time as a convener. Okay. That's a pure misuse of power, of course. But So there are some things, and I will just make a list of them, and if you get interested, we can debate them. And the first one is this whole use of exit, loyalty, and voice dynamics taken from Hirschman, and a distinction between voice being perceived as politics and exit being perceived in terms of law, and this sort of artificial dichotomy which runs through the analysis, and a very strange understanding of what loyalty can entail, again very much related to what how Hirschman understood it in his book. But potentially more interesting for today's purposes is also this religious element in the way the transformation of Europe is written. And I do not only mean the references to the Bible, which then became even more prevalent in Weiler's writings, but it's rather, and that's I think what you can feel best if you are within the discipline, and that's why I think some political scientists even might not got what the transformation of Europe was really about, because I was just struck when you read the contribution to the book by Kellerman and Alex Stone-Sweet, and they say it was the most important essay about the Court of Justice. And you just think, really? Is the transformation of Europe an essay about the Court of Justice? Is it how political scientists understand the contribution of the essay? And I think the most profound contribution to the essay was precisely the sort of language it is using, which makes the whole way of thinking about European integration and its constitution so attractive that it then drags people like Sasha, perhaps also the follow generation of Matthias, Miguel, and others into something which appeared in the 1980s as something which is just about, some market regulations. I know there were people who were interested in mutual recognition and doing serious stuff on that, but it wasn't stuff for constitutional lawyers till this was written. And it is written in this sort of language, which I think is also being conscious that in legal world, words make world. So when you say something, when you declare that constitutional discipline exists in the European Union, you just make it happen. It's not an observation. It's never innocent. It can never escape this inevitable normativity. Right, I thank the chair for being tolerant with me, and thank the convener to misuse his power. And I'll just stop at that, and would be very grateful for any sorts of comments you might have. Thank you.
I would like to ask you, Jan, if you really think just the conclusion, that if you say the word, you make it happen. It seems to me that if you read the transformation of Europe, is highly optimist that there has been this change with Maastricht, basically, that the constitutional language, the politicization is said there, but don't really see that happening. It was a constructivist attempt, but I would say largely failed.
I think we can say that with hindsight today, but I think if you just went back, and perhaps again it's my perception of Europe from an aspiring new member state, where if you read what they told you about the European Union, then of course it was a constitutional entity, of course it should have primacy, of course it has all that which is mentioned in the transformation of Europe. And then there is one other thing which I think quite contributed to the importance of this essay, and that's just an anecdote I heard, but I heard that for Dieter Grimm, when he started to think about European Union law, his first thing he read was the transformation of Europe, and before he didn't know much about European Union law. So for him, transformation of Europe was the thing which told him this is what European Union law looks like.
I don't think that was the question, but I don't want to know.
Okay, I think everybody wants to talk, but the order will be first Agustin.
Two questions. The first is, to what extent we tend not only to be jurist-centric, but also English-centric. And on that regard, I think, being from one periphery, but a different one, and being, for many reasons, Frenchophile, there was a shift in the language, in the conversation. At some point, English became the main language in order to discuss about European studies. Would not the story be different if told from a different perspective? The second one has to do with the reasons why certain articles became decisive.
Canonical. Yeah.
And I think they are decisive because we keep on saying that they are decisive. This is very obvious. But the question is whether we should keep on saying that, whether there keep on being good reasons or not, and that's the question. And the other is how they became originally so. And I think on that regard, the trajectory of Stein proves that there is a matter of luck and being in the right moment in the right place. In the following sense, Stein had been saying basically the same since 65, and nobody was listening. And then he says it again, and he succeeds. So the question is not, with full respect, admiration for Stein. I'm not diminishing Stein at all. I'm not saying it's not an important argument. I'm saying at some point he was not listened to, but at some point he's listened to. The same, up to a certain extent, that has to do with the question of language. Weiler's arguments were published in a book in Mulino in the early 80s, mid-80s. And it did not have a transformative power. The transformative power happened when it was translated into English and published at a certain time. And I would not say that in 1991, Fiesole was dominating the discourse. It's something that comes later, at some point. So the transformation of Europe is something that starts to be read and taken as a canonical text at some point later. So why? What are the reasons? What is the impact of the context? Is that the ideas are groundbreaking, or is that there is a certain demand for these kind of ideas?
Right. I was nodding throughout your question/comment because I just agree with everything, and I know that partially this question can be only answered by people like Mikhail or Antoine, because it's very much about structuring this field of knowledge, and when you contribute to it in a certain way at a certain moment, when certain conditions exist, then it can become successful, which can explain why Stein. And I also have this anecdote with him because he was Czech and we were in touch, and he didn't know I know that much about him. So the essay he sent me was not his 1981 article, but it was 1965 article. That was for him the contribution he wanted others to read, because that was when he really discovered, or when he formulated that the European Union is a constitutional beast.
Yeah.
And your second observation, like why are these articles canonical and shouldn't we just rethink? Because it's exactly, we perpetuate this story about the centrality of Fiesole and English-centered sort of constitutionalism. And I think one hypothesis I have is that it really came in the good time of the 1990s, the end of history, international liberalism, and I think the transformation of Europe is very much about it. It's very ambiguous because, and I remember a long time ago in Berlin, we had this exchange whether Weiler is pro-market or communitarian. And to me, it's very contradictory, but to me he is both. Like, he believes that he can discipline the state through the market, but at the same time he's very deeply inside him like communitarian, not liberal.
Okay, I may suggest some restraint in the questions and the answers, because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people asking to, and I mean the questions are long, the answers. So I take all the questions. I think it's a good idea. Yes. So please, first, Professor Kuhn.
So here's why the article is deservedly canonical in the way that it is. They were part of the favorable receptive conditions that also existed and made it possible. So he didn't just describe constitutionalization, not just direct effect, primacy, and then of course he also thinks fundamental rights and the interpretation of competencies play into it. He then said, but now we're in a different world because all of a sudden we have qualified majority voting as central in European politics, and now we're going to see all these tensions come up and we'll see how they get resolved. And with this kind of, and there he has completely, as a visionary basically, set up the problems and the kind of debates that we would from then on, in the next 2 decades, have about what does democracy mean in such a... Now we need to think about that, because it doesn't... not every state has to consent to basically everything. We have to think about... so we have to think about questions of authority in a way that we didn't have before. So it wasn't just the constitutionalization thesis. It was the idea that this kind of legal constitutionalization was possible without the politics, and now that we have the Single European Act and later Maastricht, we are in a different... There are new tensions that come up that need rethinking. And then come people like... Then there's the grim Habermas debate that takes seriously that tension already, take it a step further, and say, well, here's a real problem, says Grimm, this is not going to go anywhere. And then Habermas says, it's not a problem, we just have to do the right thing on the European level. But it's setting the debate. It's not just describing constitutionalization, that's old. It's setting the debate for the next 20 years, basically.
Okay, please, second question.
Yeah, two experiences that explain what we are talking about. I have a student who used to be a research assistant in the European Law department in my faculty, and she's interested in writing a doctoral dissertation with me. She's never heard the name of Joseph Weiler before I mentioned it to her. Yeah? Then, I was asked to contribute to a workshop and a book on European integration and legal theory, and I couldn't participate because I had Andrea San Giovanni as a guest in Vienna. I didn't participate. I later looked at the volume. Not once is Maduro mentioned, not once is Joseph Weiler mentioned. It's not there on the national level. We talk about two different worlds. There's the international bubble in which we move around, and fortunately, yeah, because I like to be in that bubble, but then there are the national and the national players, yeah, who simply do not pay attention to what is done here. I mean, Christian Jürgens can tell you stories about Germany, I'm sure, yeah. So, next, one more addition. I think Fiesole is not as important as was the fact that Weiler was at Harvard and running the Jean Monnet program in Harvard and throwing out one working paper after the other. I mean, that wasn't authored by him, yeah, but one working paper after the other was published and available on the internet. This is how he actually managed to dominate, and his program to dominate the whole discourse. This was the key to it, I think. Harvard, not Fiesole.
American, not English, as well.
Yeah, American. Okay, sorry, these are just observations. You don't have to.
So, thank you. And following up on Sasha, I do have a similar reading that I'm wondering if these false messiahs, Stein, Weiler, and they do live in an epistemic community that wants to see somehow an Americanization of the European federal dream, which is pushed by Stein. And that so. I do buy the Harvard thesis because that's when he produces much more as opposed to raising money in NYU and doing much more, maybe creating more the epistemic community rather than producing himself to be the Messiah. Right. So for me, why then Europe become relevant for the United States? A different question. Why is he somehow also a messiah in Europe? And the argument that Duncan Kennedy always told me was like, until the Weiler piece, I wasn't able to understand what was going on in Europe. So what he does, he adopts the kind of politicization of federalists that we know here. We were talking about Lochner versus New York, and then you have the Warren Court. This idea that the tension that Matthias was talking about, they are so endemic. If you learn about U.S. constitutional law, you cannot rely on the Supreme Court. It's going to flip depending on where Congress is and depending who's the new president is going to elect the judges. So the politicization or constitutionalization and then eventually politicization of Europe is something that Weiler explained, something that he explained very well to the Americans. And then with the money of Harvard, he could project these even before Fiesole. I totally agree with that.
Please.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with this point about Harvard. I was there, and I remember when Joseph arrived. I mean, I wasn't at the law school, but we were a little kind of, epistemic community of EU studies. We all left actually the same year of '98. It's kind of bizarre. And at the time, indeed, Joseph arriving. I'm talking about people in IR and political science. Now, of course, his arrival, and it's very much a Jean Monnet, the whole institutional side of things rather than transformation of Europe. Yeah. But from the, talking about bubbles, clearly for us, I mean, Jan, you were, surprised that Dan and co said, oh, well, about the court. But you've got to see it from the other side's viewpoint. I mean, we'd been embroiled into all these debates from a political science viewpoint about the relationship between ideas, power, and interest in the EU, which institutions reflect power, in what sense, whose power, all of these things. And the court was kind of at the periphery. So that's why, political science is like, wow, and this is before Karen Alter, woo, now suddenly you're putting the court in our picture. But it's still not central. And we look at you guys like, whoa, they have a court. It's a Copernican thing. You've got the court at the center, and for you guys, it kind of puts a bit of politics in.
Right.
For you guys, I mean, for lawyers, in the story. But for us, and continued. I mean, I was struck by how Moravcik and others, I mean, never really put the court in their analysis. So, I mean, for political scientists who took it all seriously, and that kind of came later. Of course, it's about the dance between law and politics, and that's useful. But, and you're totally right, Jan, that partly we're looking at this and saying, why is voice only political, so-called? I mean, the court and the courts, plural, are a voice, and similarly, exit is very much negotiated. Every intergovernmental negotiation is about negotiating proxies for. So you've got selective exit that is forbidden by the court, but at the same time, the member states are busy inventing all sorts of ways of proxies for exit. I remember because I co-wrote, the Amsterdam Treaty article on structured cooperation and partial exits and all of that, and I mean, the court jurisprudence was, irrelevant to that story. So we're thinking through all these other ways of making the EU constitutional settlement flexible enough to accommodate diversity, and the court is at the periphery. So that's the first point: is that definitely trying to take different disciplinary and different agency in this system is really important. And I do have a problem with. I mean, it's a great. Of course, I share everybody's great admiration for the piece, but it wasn't so central for, EU studies, what we call the EU studies, right? And then the second bit is about, for me, the underplaying in the positivist kind of legal analysis of the very important, third part of the article, that is the equilibrium. Mm-hmm. Not only the equilibrium, but the fact that it's precious and that we're losing it. And, I think for many of us, that's the most important bit, because that's what informs, that's what gives its energy, its momentum to the thing. If you didn't have, at the end of the day, a desire to point to the fact that we are at a crucial moment when this precious equilibrium might be lost in this and that way, the piece wouldn't have its force. It's kind of led by this normative momentum. And so then you kind of take that and you run with it. I mean, I happen to have kind of looked at this from a different viewpoint, but this is where some of us coalesced, in this normative agenda. And I think this is the sense in which it relates the most to our project here on constitutional imaginaries. He talks about the writing on the wall. I mean, it's very, and that, and that's the bit, the alarm. I think that we need to kind of work with.
Please.
Yeah. What I would pay some attention to is his origin in international law, because there is clearly a tension between international law, which is no law at all for me anyway, but okay. But there is also, you see that the importance of the state in his writing, the importance of intergovernmentalism, also in the beginning, the tension between intergovernmentalism and supranational. There's a lot of international law thinking, and he has continued that later in an article in the Heidelberg Journal, where he tried to open up international law for regulatory purposes. This is the one thing. The other one is my constant complaint. Where is the economy? This is European economic community, but we don't talk about the economy. And what was the driver? I mean, of integration. If not, okay, it can. But these are two aspects where I think we should be careful and attentive.
And then I will challenge this distribution of us and them, especially because I have nice colleagues and people that I love attending. So if is any question, any very fast, brief question of the people who's here in the public? The people, with the people. Please, Professor Petersen.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I was wondering about of course, the very general European, Eurocentric perspective here, but I was also wondering, perhaps in relation to this discussion on the role of Weiler, etc., to what extent is that related to also a changing geopolitical power shift taking place during this period you're discussing? Is that not something which might also be taken into account?
And power shift between?
The decline of the U.S., the power shift towards Asia. I mean, it's not so surprising perhaps that Weiler is important in the 90s, but after the 90s, this general shift is going on and the US is seeing this decline, so he may not be so important in the EU and in Europe either, which is also sort of withdrawing from the global scene.
Yeah, just to thank you, because most of it was not really questions, but rather comments, remarks. And on this last question, yeah, I think that's also reflected by the decline of the interest into the European Union in the United States as such. After 2004, it was already before the Euro crisis when like LLM courses were suddenly about Asia and not about the European Union. So yeah, definitely. And otherwise, yeah, just thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, I do not want to spend next 5 years thinking about Joseph Weiler only. So it's really just the beginning of something which I hope will be something else. But that's what I have now, because to me, again, he is a starting point. So.